Sometimes life gives us lemons. Sometimes it gives us lemonade. Other times it gives us something entirely out of left field that makes us say, WTF. But no matter what obstacles come, there is most often a way out on the other side, and we are once again victorious. My name is Dr. Rowe, and you are listening to my podcast about resilience. Every guest shares a tragedy to triumph story to give listeners like you the inspiration to push through every single day. Listen now as my next guest shares how they were life-jacked.
What do you do when bad luck seems to follow you at every turn and interrupts your life's work? My name is Dr. Rowe, and this is LifeJacked, the Resilience Podcast. LifeJacked is when an unfortunate or unplanned event happens to jack with your life. My guest for this week, Frank DiMaio, will share his 3 A's for building resilience. He grew up in Rhode Island as the son of restaurant owners. He became a chiropractor and built a successful practice until tragedy struck. Frank is an author with several works in progress, a sculptor, a photographer, and a public speaker. His second full-length book, A Promise Made, A Promise Kept, A Husband's Journey Through Journaling to Heal the Loss of His Spouse, is about overcoming the impact of breast cancer and the promise made to his late wife to sail to Bermuda. Listen as he shares his path to healing. Hi, Frank. Welcome. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show. How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully, Dr. Rowe, and thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with your guests.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. So you've had a couple of bad incidences that have definitely life-jacked you. So can you briefly share your personal journey?
Well, my personal journey began when I didn't realize it was a personal journey. My wife had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and we were struggling through that process of treatment and emotional degradation that comes along with it. But what I hadn't realized was that all of my angst, all of my fears and my anger and my emotional disquiet was actually linked to childhood, was linked to my learned behaviors. Now, granted, that may be a mouthful, but I didn't recognize that until 8 years after my wife passed away. And that was where the quandary comes in, because we were doing and being and trying to put our best foot forward for the family and to do the best that we could for each other, because we were partners, lovers, and friends. But the dichotomy comes when your partner dies. She passes away, and then she's no longer there, or he, doesn't matter, because men get breast cancer also. But that loss threw me into a tizzy. Now, I had an end-of-life list, which, wishes Judith wanted me to complete, and I was working on that. And one of them happened to be to raise funds for breast cancer awareness by sailing solo to Bermuda and doing that. It was a challenge for myself. It was a way of expressing my respect for my wife in her struggle, in her strength, and her dignity. I wanted other people to recognize who she was, because she wasn't just important to me. She was important to family members. She was important to students. She was important to her friends and acquaintances along the way as an instructor and teacher. But when that partnership is gone, you're lost. I was lost. And it took me a long time to get my feet firmly planted underneath me. And that was the beginning of my journey.
Your wife asked you to sail to Bermuda. Why Bermuda? What was the significance behind that?
Well, we both grew up growing up in Rhode Island, being on the water is like a birthright. So we both grew up sailing. I learned sailing in Boy Scouts, and she learned sailing from her father-in-law and from her first marriage. And so we were always on the water. Her brothers were captains and had their own sailboats, and her daughter Natasha continues to sail. She's an instructor at a sailing school in LA, as well as a college professor. So sailing and being on the water is a second nature kind of thing. That said, Judith wanted to take a cruise to Bermuda during the time that she happened to, when she was sick. And I said, no, I'm not into cruise ships, because if I get on that ship, I'm just going to go right up to the wheelhouse, tell the captain to move over, because I want to steer the boat. So she said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? I'll take the cruise ship over to Bermuda, and you sail to Bermuda. And then we can sail around the island and have a wonderful time, and then you sail back, and I'll take the cruise ship back home. But we never were able to fulfill that little jaunt. But in the meantime, I decided to follow through with that and raise the funds for breast cancer awareness and make the sail. But it had a few fits and starts, and it took a while. It took me 3 years to complete that promise, that portion of her end-of-life wishes.
Well, no matter how long it took you, Frank, I commend you for even just completing the task. So that is amazing.
Yeah, like I said, it had its fits and starts. I learned a lot of lessons along the way. And there were things that were technical in nature, and others were just simply wish I had a V8 moment, It kind of plop you up on the head and take you away. But they were not lost on me. All of the lessons and the quandaries and the difficulties and the struggles that I went through in the process of making that sail improved my self-esteem, gave me a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't had in a long time. And yeah, right, fine, you're a chiropractor. Wasn't that an accomplishment in itself? Yes, it was. And I loved my practice. But to complete a list of end-of-life wishes for your wife takes on a different tone, an emotional tone that can be considered depressing, debilitating, fill you with despair and sorrow and anger and fear of the future. And I felt every single one of those things. I just couldn't make any sense of what I needed to do right then in the moment. It took time for me to digest things. I'm not quick to understand, kind of like something that has to percolate with me. I have to put things in writing, and the journaling was astronomical in its impact, because the book never would have come about had I not written in my journal at all.
Now, I want to go back to, you mentioned that you were a chiropractor, and I want to kind of talk about that, because that essentially was what you decided to do for a profession, but then that was cut short.
At the time, I was going through a divorce from my first wife, and that's when Judith and I met, after the fact, so to speak. But at the same time, I used to power lift for exercise, for enjoyment, to just exert physical activity, and I needed that given the stress of the divorce and the difficulties I was having with the practice, making ends meet and things like that. But one night, I was with friends and we were working out, and I had a large amount of weight on the bar, and I was going to put it back on the rack, and I just happened to turn the wrong way, and I sneezed and coughed at the same time. Both me and the rack of weights hit the floor. That was it. I herniated a couple of discs, and that, to me, that was, no big deal. Like, I got colleagues that can take care of me and get me over the hump. But the difficulty was the position of the herniations. And it became a problem because my neurosurgeon friends who I played golf with, they're all standing there rubbing their index fingers together, deciding who's going to be the one to cut into me. And I told them, I said, we're standing there in front of the view boxes for the MRI, and I said, you guys are out of luck because you know me. I'm not going to go for any surgical procedure. And they said, well, Frank, we're only going to give you like 6 months. You have 2 specific herniations on one single disc that is going to incapacitate you and could cause some serious health issues. I said, okay. I understood what they were talking about. And I said, okay, look, let me do this. Give me 3 months. If I can't show at least a 30% improvement in my situation by then you guys can draw the short straw on who's gonna do me on the table. So they agreed, and I followed through with chiropractic care, and I got that 30% like right at the bell hour. It was like, oh my God! 2 days before the appointment, I was still hobbling, my foot was still dropping, and within 2 days, I had almost had a completely normal gait. So when I went to see my neurosurgeon friend Paul, he said, "Hey, you're not cutting." He goes, "Oh, come on." He was making a joke out of it. I said, "No, look, I'm good." I walked and he looked and he goes, "Holy crap." He says, "You're doing okay." I said, "Yeah, but pain level is still there. I can't bend forward. There's no way I'm going to be able to provide adjustive procedures to my patients because I'm a hands-on chiropractor. What am I going to do?" He says, "I don't know." He said, "But just keep going with your care and do the best you can." Well, it took me 18 months, Dr. Rowe, before I could get back on my feet completely. But by then, I didn't have a practice anymore. I was a solo practitioner. I tried bringing someone in to work the practice for me. That didn't work out. Patients left. So I ended up without a profession, essentially. And it was heartbreaking. It was a monkey in my wrench that I did not want or deserve. But life is just going to keep rolling the bowling ball down your alley, and sooner or later you're going to knock a few pins down. It knocked me down for sure.
Now, you also had a horrible car accident that left you fighting for your life for 3 months. So in between the diagnosis of the breast cancer, the herniated disc from powerlifting, where does the car accident fall?
I didn't have any confidence anymore. I had lost all sense of ability. The car accident happened when I was 20 years old, and that was the impetus for me to want to go to medical school, and ended up going to chiropractic school instead, because I realized that everything that I wanted to do as a physician, I could do without having to go to medical school. I could do it as a chiropractic physician. And I don't have to deal with drugs, and I don't have to deal with surgery, and I don't have to do rounds or any of that sort of thing. But in actuality, I did, because when we did our internship, we had OBGYN at a hospital in Queens, and we did all of the geriatric through the same hospital, and then we had our internship in the clinic in Manhattan. So all of those things, except not having to deal with emergency room procedure or surgical procedure or pharmaceutical intervention, which is the mainstay of medicine, I didn't have to worry about any of that. I needed to understand it. So when patients came into my office and they say, well, I'm on this and I'm on that, and I have to know what the medicine is so that I understand what their contraindications are and whether or not those contraindications are actually being presented as symptoms from them coming into my office. And that's where the differential diagnosis comes in. That's where your education and your training really takes hold for you as a physician.
With all of these different experiences, how do you feel they have affected or shaped your perspective on life?
The biggest challenge, I would say, would be finding the strength to forgive myself, establish a baseline of emotion, and what did I expect, or can I improve? What did I expect of myself? What can I improve in the moment, or will guide me, or focus my intentions in a positive direction? Because you're frazzled. You're emotionally frazzled. You're physically frazzled. Your health is a direct connection to your emotional stability, because the trilogy of the mind, body, spirit is very, very strong, very important to understand. But in light of all of the new research that's come out about disease and illness and sickness, the mind being in control of the body was foreign. It wasn't a concept or an idea that held a lot of water in the medical profession, because you either have a disease or you don't. And if you don't have a disease, then you're healthy. But that's not true, because your mental state, your emotional state, has a direct impact on the physiology of your system. And that connection is what really people need to break out of. I needed to break out of, because I had to find out what parts of my body was I stuck in. What was I misguided or misdirected? If I'm having stomach troubles, or I'm having difficulty with a particular symptom, what's initiating it? Where's it coming from? Is it organ-based? Is it strictly emotional? Is it something that I was traumatized by, like car accident? That is a straight up environment, a PTSD situation, because that was such a traumatic event that it changes you and how you perceive not only yourself, but how you perceive yourself in space in terms of who you are and everyone else around you. They say the goal is to be the observer and not the observed when you're traumatized, because that's the victim concept. That's the mechanism that is so dramatic to an individual, because you lose a sense of yourself. Self-esteem gets chipped away. You don't feel comfortable with yourself. You begin to think in terms of negative self-speak. I can't, I won't, I don't deserve, I'm not capable of. And these are all things that I brought forward in my life because of the learned behaviors of the traumas that I sustained from a young age. And you don't realize they stack up, and they become this oscillating wave of emotion that you're traveling through in different layers in your life. And by the time Judith passed away and I went through that period of time, 8 years before I got into peer counseling, support group counseling for my learned behaviors, I wasn't recognizing the fact that all of those negative things that I had been exposed to growing up had literally stockpiled on my emotional well-being. And because of the trauma of loss, of losing my wife, and all the other situations that had piled up during my life, I wasn't aware that they were literally the building blocks of dysfunctional emotional stability. And I needed to confront them and break them apart and figure out a way to overcome them. So in all that period of time, all these concepts and ideas and all of my research on power of words and writing, and started to create a process like the 3 A's, or the what, why, and how, or my acronym for habit. These are all components of an individual who was striving to move forward with positive intention. Whereas before, I was nothing but a survivalist. I was strictly going day to day, moment to moment, trying to put out fires if they came about, rather than planting trees to have a forest. I was dousing stuff with gasoline, setting my emotional stability into a tizzy.
Now, you mentioned your emotional stability, which is very important when you're going through each of these different situations. Could you talk about the support systems or resources that were instrumental in helping you?
Well, in the beginning, I didn't have any. It was just myself. I did go to hospice. They had offered grief counseling. And this is actually the impetus for my having written the book. because when I went to that counseling session, I was fully expecting, Dr. Rowe, that there would be other men there who had lost their wives to breast cancer, so that there was an element of camaraderie, an element of connectedness that could be shared within that room, and there wasn't another husband there. Granted, grief counseling offered by hospice is an umbrella. It does what they expect it to do and help people through that process. But I felt very isolated because of the breast cancer and because of the past learned behaviors and things that have impacted me. I just did not feel the comfort or have the expectation that the process that they were presenting was going to be beneficial for me. I wanted other husbands to know that, number one, they weren't alone, and number two, that there's a possibility and the potential is there for us as husbands to find some support in one another, in recognizing that we were or are our wives knights in shining armor. We're there to be protective. We're there to be the head of the household. That's one world. My feet were in two worlds. One was in that world of protective, be the head of the household, learn through example, learn by example from my dad, my uncles, my grandfather. They all taught me to be stoic and to have the answers and to be protective of family. And yet the other foot was in the world of breast cancer, which I had no tools. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't take it away. All I could do was be as supportive as I possibly could to my wife. But when you're in that two separate worlds, you're at a loss because you have no compass. You have no core value or moral value compass that you can function with, because your life is in total disarray.
Now, after going through that experience, and I know you said you had no tools to use to go by, but what advice do you think you could give possibly to someone else who is supporting a loved one that's going through a breast cancer battle, whether it be a spouse or a son or daughter, a sibling, a parent? What advice do you think you would be able to give someone?
It took me a long time to become present for my wife, because we're both in emotional trauma just from the diagnosis. But as far as being a partner, a family member, a sister or brother, is to be present, to be supportive, and don't give advice, especially if, say, it's your family, you have a family member who is being treated for breast cancer and you're not directly in that relationship. Don't give advice. It's the wrong thing to do. What you need to be is a listener. Put a piece of duct tape on your mouth and just sit there and let that person vent, scream, yell, pound the table. But in being a listener and being silent is probably the most important gift you can give that individual, because they're not looking for answers. They have got no answers. They don't want to be told, oh, you can get through this, or you'll get over it. Or I had so many family members say, get over it. When are you going to get past this grief? I say, grief doesn't go away, folks. Grief changes. Grief is not something that you can take an aspirin and be well the next day. Stages of acceptance. It's those 3 A's. Accept, acknowledge, and assimilate all of those components, one bite at a time. It's like putting a toe in the pool because you realize it's too cold. And you put it in again and it feels a little bit warmer because the skin's warmed up. And yet, next thing you know, you're putting your foot in there, and it's a process. You'll get into the pool soon enough, but if you try to jump in all at once, the shock will kill you.
Now, you mentioned the 3 A's. So can you kind of share for your 3 A's for building resilience?
First, you have to acknowledge the fact that you have an emotion. Look at it from the perspective of it being concrete, textured. Put your hand on it. You can see it, you can taste it, you can hear it, feel it. But once you've done that, it compartmentalizes it. It puts it in the perspective for you so that you can work with it, deal with it, accept it. Once you're able to do that, then the process of assimilation comes in where you're just digesting it. You're just taking it in and allowing it to have its moment. That's extremely important. So when you go through those A's, you actually are taking upon yourself to break down your emotional disquiet into fragments that you can digest. And from the 3 A's, what came out was what, why, and how. So what was the cause? Why did I have the reaction? And how am I going to resolve? And all of this gets put together in an emotional package that you can journal, you can write about, you can put down on paper. Putting pen to paper is extremely important. I mentioned it before because that was the impetus for writing the book. But for an individual who's going through this process of survivor's grief, trauma, personal trauma, trying to find an element or a situation that you can embrace to improve your resiliency, it's all about that.
You have a new book that you're writing. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about this new book?
The new book is called The Psychology of Healing, the Subconscious Connection. And it's based on all of my research on the power of words that I've been doing since 2013, but it's more on the impact person subconscious has on them, because 90% of the brain is subconscious, with some percentage thereof. And that is, it has no feeling, it has no recognition of what it is that you may be experiencing, because it's black and white. There's no gray area in the subconscious. Now, there's a portion of the frontal part of the brain that's involved with executive function, and that's the analyzer. That's the portion of the brain that's going to take things apart so that you can figure out how it works. But the subconscious is totally different. And what happens is that when I started to do the writing about that, something amazing came out. And that was, I read, I'm still reading, a book by Florence Shin, who in the early part of the 20th century was on the same level of understanding and commitment as people like James Allen, Charles Fillmore, other individuals who spoke well on concepts of prosperity. But what I didn't realize, and what I did come to find out, was prosperity isn't just about money. It's the mainstay of many in the publishing field who write about prosperity and how to get it, how to keep it, how to move with it. It's all well and good, but it's not the only thing. It's not the end all. The end all is your emotional prosperity, and how your trilogy, mind, body, spirit, is reflected in your physical health, your emotional well-being, your mental state, your spiritual enthusiasm, and the material, which would be considered the money, the prosperity that everyone seems to be striving for and then losing sight of at different points in times in their lives. But what happens is that when that's the main focus, the family, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the mental, all suffer. These are your pillars. They all tend to be lost in muck and mire of the dollar sign because of someone pushing in that direction. And that's the whole impetus behind the psychology of healing and the subconscious connection. It's to make people understand that their well-being, their health, their success as a person, having a profession, owning a business, having a family, having children, being members of a family, being the grandparents are all important and are probably more important than that one single material component or pillar, because it's not necessarily true, but I have to admit that if you do what you love, the money will come. And when I did my sculpting and I did my writing and I did things that were of service, sculpting wouldn't necessarily be considered a point of service, but when someone hires you to do a sculpture, you're serving them. You know, you're going to create something that they are going to either appreciate or not, depending on how they view what you've created.
So that's the topic I want to kind of go into next is, so now you're into sculpting. You are a sculptor. So how did you get into sculpting, and how do you decide what to sculpt? Is it people just make requests, or you just have inspiration? How do your sculptures come about?
When I had herniated the discs and I couldn't go back to chiropractic practice, Judith and I had to sit down, powwow. We was like, okay, what am I going to do now? I've got a very specific niche of training here. She says, well, what do you like to do? I said, well, I like to do a lot of stuff. I said, I like to draw. I like designing. She goes, well, okay, so you like working in the dirt? I said, yeah, I love working in dirt. Give me a wheelbarrow and a shovel, a pair of gloves, and I'll dig a trench for you. I don't care. It's like happy. But there was a program that she found that was a crossover profession. In other words, they had a master's degree in landscape architecture for other professionals. In other words, it's not, you don't do an undergraduate degree. You actually apply for this program coming from a different profession. And I got accepted, and that was the beginning. So we wanted to live in the Southwest. So after a year of schoolwork, we moved to the Southwest, and I reapplied to the University of New Mexico, which at the time was ranked third in the country for this type of program. So I was pretty excited about that. But I got rejected.
Oh, no.
I actually got rejected. And I have to give the head of the department credit, because he recognized the fact that I was coming from a totally different profession into a new one. And he said, your portfolio is not bad. He said, but it's not extensive. You need to build this portfolio up. So I'm going to suggest that you take studio courses, and then reapply next year. I said, okay, I'll do that. So I did. I went to the University of New Mexico while our daughter Natasha was going there for her theater, and did the studio courses and built up my portfolio. And that's when I realized, because I was all sculpting, that I not only had the talent with my hands to be a successful chiropractic physician, but I had the hands and the talent to sculpt. And that's where it started. Now, here comes the other acts. The year goes by. I got a 3.96 GPA. I reapply. I got a killer portfolio. What happens? I got rejected.
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so then the excuse was, well, we had a lot of top applicants and all this kind of going on. And I said, okay, fine. So Judith and I packed our bags. We left Natasha in New Mexico to finish her education. And we moved back east to Virginia. And that was a couple of years prior to her diagnosis. Yeah, that's how I got into sculpting. And I still do it. My work it's in galleries, mostly in Canada, actually. Toronto GTA area. I have people that purchased my work online. It's in private collections in Ohio, California, Rhode Island, Virginia. Not here in Florida yet, but yeah, it's all right. No big. I got other things going on.
So you ended up sculpting without having any formal training and going through and having your sculptures inside of museums anyway.
Yes.
That is amazing. That is just remarkable. Well, Frank, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you. Please take the time to let everyone know how they can purchase a copy of your books or contact you for speaking engagements.
The book can be purchased on Amazon. If you type in the title, the entire title, or just type in my name, the book will come up. Also, I have a survivor's guide that I've written as a help guide. And if you go to my website, fjdwriter.com, on the initial page, you'll see a button that says guide. If you click on that and fill out the information, I will send you via email a copy of my survivor's guide. It's only like 17 pages long. It's very brief. It is what I used personally to help me and what I've used personally to help other people that I have coached in terms of finding resilience and overcoming some of the traumas of trauma and grief. So that's available. The other, as far as speaking engagements, you can do the same thing, fill that out, and I will send you my speaker one sheet, which will give you an outline of presentations that I do, and we can communicate in that way and discuss what it is that your personal desires are, your personal or business expectations are for your company, your employees, or an organization that you have. Because the message is uplifting, it's inspirational, and provides opportunity for people to find that subconscious connection in themselves to be personally, emotionally, physically, and mentally healthy.
Any last words of encouragement for the listeners?
Yeah. I have a quote, and it's from Aristotle. Suffering becomes beautiful when anyone bears great calamity with cheerfulness, not through insensibility, but through gestures of mind.
Well, Frank, I wish you nothing but blessings and abundance. Thank you so much for persevering throughout your life, although it hasn't, of course, as I said before, luck hasn't always been on your side, but I commend you for pushing through and not giving up. Please take care.
Well, thank you, and that's the element of resilience, to push through.
You have just listened to Life Jacked, the Resilience Podcast with your host, Dr. Rowe. Subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pandora, Spotify, and any other podcast streaming platform. Remember to live, laugh, love, learn, and then repeat. See you in the next episode.